for all the talk of teamwork, look after yourself, and not meaning that in a selfish way, but like, if you can't function, you're no use to anyone else.
Welcome back to the World Extreme Medicine podcast with myself, Owen Walker. In this session, we're speaking with Ryan Atkinson about his vast experience working across the globe as a cinematographer. Ryan has spent 12 years filming wildlife and science filmmaking for the likes of the BBC Natural History Unit, Netflix, and National Geographic. His work has taken him to over 50 countries on 6 continents, specialising particularly in polar and mountain environments, and it's seen him joining expeditions of all shapes and sizes, from a 20-strong team abseiling into the world's most active volcano to months spent following polar bears across the Norwegian ice pack. So Ryan has been no stranger to expedition hazards and has experienced minor frost nip in minus 37 degrees, and he's also been medevac'd following a scorpion sting in Tanzania. So having volunteered for 8 years as a mountain rescue, his life took a slight turn with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, where he decided to swap the tropical jungles for concrete jungles in 2021, and he's now about to finish his training as an emergency medical technician with London Ambulance Service. So Ryan has a particular interest in trauma and critical care and has a view to progressing on to his paramedic training in 2023 and then on from there. So we're going to dig into that and much more within the podcast and explore Ryan's colourful past and indeed his more adventurous side. Welcome to the podcast, Ryan.
Hi, Owen. How are you doing?
So Ryan, could you start with just giving us a short history of what got you into filmmaking in the first place? Sure.
Yeah. So I studied documentary photography at university, kind of following on from the normal sort of GCSEs in media and film at A-level. Whilst I was at university, I joined the climbing society, ended up leading the climbing society and training as a climbing instructor. And sort of basically, I kind of got into sort of documentary and expedition filmmaking for quite selfish reasons. Initially, I sort of wanted to go to cool places and take cool photographs and trick people into paying me to do it without ever actually feeling like I was working. But also, I guess, it was a passion for telling stories. I think a lot of people sort of tend to either excel in sort of creative stuff or in technical and science related things. And I didn't really excel in either, but really enjoyed both. And I guess a lot of it came from wanting to pursue a career that mixed the two aspects, was both very kind of creatively stimulating, but also had lots of technical challenges to it. And I think although my degree was stills photography, I sort of was forced to work with the video students during my final year. And so I kind of did a collaborative project with them, kicking and screaming, and then soon realized that actually video was a really powerful medium to complement photography. And instead of taking one photo every 35 seconds, I could take sort of 25 to 35 photos every second instead, and see where that went. So I guess that's kind of where it came from. So I graduated in 2010. And went freelance into the world of filmmaking immediately upon graduating.
So Ryan, you started to sort of transcend some more mundane environments for extreme environments. Could you maybe speak to the appeal of working in extreme environments and indeed maybe that journey into them?
Sure, yeah. So when I first went freelance, I worked on a lot of dramas and commercials. They were the opportunities available to me at the time. I was still climbing instructing to sort of supplement those early days, and spent a lot of time working, and I hope no one holds it against me, but working on productions like Casualty at the BBC. But I always knew that working in kind of extreme environments and natural history and expedition environments was where I wanted to go. I think it was a desire to effectively combine my passions and my hobbies with my work, really. and I was, I guess, attracted to the balance of kind of self-reliance, but also teamwork that's encountered in extreme environments. You've got to be a resourceful individual, but also a really well integrated member of a team. And that really appealed to me. And as I say, a lot of it came from just wanting to go to really amazing places, and tell cool stories, find those stories and communicate them with other people. I was fundamentally a storyteller. Yeah. So I think I was really attracted to working at the sharp end of sort of the important issues that we're facing at the moment, whether that's climate change, animal extinction, things like that. But working in extreme environments allowed me to witness these firsthand, which was a really powerful experience, and something I'm really glad I pursued. But since then, it sort of very quickly evolved from those sort of selfish reasons of just wanting to go to really cool places and do good stuff into recognizing the importance of all these issues and the importance of communicating them. So kind of over the years, I went from just snatching every piece of work that came my way to having a sort of desire to work on productions and in environments that had more of a purpose behind them. But before I got into this, I had basically traveled to Belgium, the United States, and a school trip to Spain. Other than that, I had not been outside of the United Kingdom. So it all snowballed quite quickly for me.
Well, it certainly did. Looking at, over 50 countries on 6 continents, and indeed, just a real diversity of places and work projects. Could you maybe speak to sort of some of the most hostile conditions you've worked in, Ryan?
Yeah, I think hostile is a tricky one. I naturally shy away from the word hostile. I think lots of things can be hostile with the wrong approach, but quite tame with the right approach. But I guess I would split hostile down into 2 contexts. So global travel to me and kind of expedition environments, you encounter, I guess, two broad areas of hostility. And I would sort of classify that as, you've got, on one hand, you've got environmental hostility. So really harsh environments, difficult climatic conditions, things like that. And then on the other hand, you have human hostility, where you're working maybe in conflict zones or areas where there's a lot of cultural issues or security issues. And they are two elements that can make an environment very hostile, but require a very different approach. Sort of from an environmental perspective, for me, you already mentioned in the introduction there, I specialized in polar and mountain environments. But I've also worked extensively, in the rainforest, in caves, in coastal environments. And what's really, interesting is that every environment has its very own, has its own unique challenges, requires very distinct skills, distinct experiences and attitudes to approach those environments. Mountain environments require a lot of physical fitness to overcome the specific challenges of those, a lot of attention to detail and broader knowledge around things like weather and the technical expertise required to operate in a mountain in a high altitude environment. Rainforests, it's more about having basically resilience, resourcefulness, being able to adapt to whatever's in front of you and sort of come up with ways of overcoming those challenges. Caves, I think they just require a unique skill set of a lack of self-respect and dignity, really, to survive in those environments. A week down a cave, sleeping on piles of bat poo, I think you just need to accept that you're not going to be very clean and throw all pretenses of being neat and tidy out of the window, and that's just about gritting your teeth and getting through. But human hostility is a completely different ballgame. Speaking of hostile environments, I think I don't like to categorize countries and places in terms of hostility. I think it's unfair. I think it's unproductive. It doesn't get us anywhere. There's hostility everywhere you go in terms of human hostility. There's hostility here in London. There's hostility in rural parts of the UK. There's hostility in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and places like that. It's about approaching that hostility from a open-minded and productive place, having good cultural awareness, which really comes from good preparation. And just simple things like in the early days, approaching environments. I remember doing shoots in places like Madagascar, where there was a lot of banditry going on at the time, in Pakistan, shortly after some of the big conflicts that had gone just over the border with Afghanistan. And simple things like picking up a Lonely Planet guide for the area every time before I went to a new place and reading about the cultural aspects of that area, the religious aspects, how I could be sensitive to the kind of context of the country I was visiting. And I think that goes a long way to overcoming that hostility. So I guess, like I say, it's, I shy away from the word hostile because I think an environment and a culture is what you make of it and what you approach it with.
I think it's good to actually differentiate, as you said, and actually there's plenty of nuances in, like you said, each culture and indeed each culturally hostile environment. And you, as you were saying and speaking to environment scanning and doing your research and looking at some of the research coming from the indigenous populations or indeed people on the ground is absolutely prudent, and it's very different, like you said, to the research you might do when you go into a environmentally hostile environment. Maybe if we could just pivot for a second, Ryan, and look at your work with the BBC Natural History Unit. Sort of what did that entail, and what did you learn from working with them?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the first programs I worked on that was put out by the BBC Natural History Unit was The Hunt, a David Attenborough program some years ago now. It's a little odd in that it wasn't produced directly by the Natural History Unit. It was produced by an independent production company that was set up by a previous head of the Natural History Unit, but it was very much BBC DNA. And it was, the first shoot I did for them was out to Madagascar. It was also one of my first big foreign shoots, certainly in the context of more remote environments. And it was a great training ground on the sort of demands of high-end television production in those environments, working on these big, what we call blue chip wildlife productions, namely, the stuff that you see narrated by David Attenborough. There's a lot of conflicting goals in that. And I think, starting that part of my filming career in Madagascar was great. It's a relatively tame expedition environment. Relatively speaking, it's still a remote country with lots of challenges, both from an environmental and a security perspective. But what I like to tell people is that there is pretty much nothing in the Madagascan rainforest that can kill you, which is almost unique in rainforests, really. There's leeches, and I had some fun experiences with those, but there's not really anything particularly dangerous from a flora and fauna perspective out there. So it was great, to learn about working in those environments. I was out there with some very experienced team members with a wealth of knowledge who sort of took me under their wing. And then just learning from a production perspective about balancing the different goals and looking at what was achievable for us within the context of budgets, within the context of the time available to us, and the acceptable risk that we were willing to take to kind of achieve those goals. So I learned a lot on those early shoots to Madagascar, other shoots I did after that to places like Chile and Borneo and Peru. Learning a lot about adaptability, learning a lot about travel. As I say, I barely left the UK before all of this started, so I was very naive initially, but it is a steep learning curve, and I think it was a real privilege to work with such a prestigious group like the BBC Natural History Unit, and their reputation globally for working in these environments, telling stories in a sensitive way, and just excellence in what they do. It was a real privilege to sort of have my early years under their wing in that way.
It sounds like it solidifies some really good practice, and it looks like you carry that forward, because let's look sort of fast forwarding slightly and looking for your work with Netflix. Again, a massive multinational company now. Could you maybe speak to your work with them and some of the diversity of experience you gathered with the Netflix?
Yeah, I came a long way, I think, between my early days on The Hunt and my more recent work with Netflix. I think one story that really, I probably should have touched on it in the previous section, but I remember my first night arriving on location in Madagascar on my first big shoot. This was still back on The Hunt. I remember getting into my rainforest lodge, and there were just insects and spiders and critters all over the place. And I was like tired and jet lagged, and it was a new environment. I didn't really know where I was or what I was doing. And I grabbed some toilet paper out of the bathroom, and I was sort of going around this little one-room lodge, stuffing toilet paper in all these big cracks, thinking, oh, that'll keep me safe. And then I sort of tucked myself away for the night in bed and did the whole, tucking my mosquito net under the mattress. I'm not going to get malaria on this shoot. Keep myself safe. And then waking up at about 2:00 in the morning, rolling over and seeing a massive gecko on the pillow next to me. And I just thought, well, that was all pretty pointless, wasn't it? Whereas now, I go out to these places working on some of the more recent productions I've done for Netflix, and gone are the days of tucking in mosquito nets, gone are the days of trying to avoid critters and insects and snakes and all of it. You just learn to live alongside it instead. My first big shoot for Netflix was Our Planet, which I think went into production a good 4 or 5 years ago now. The time cycle on these productions is generally 4 years from initial filming to actually being out on TV. By that time, I'd built up so much more expedition experience. I'd seen a lot more of the world. I'd been to a lot more environments. I'd worked with a lot of people who'd mentored me very well, and I'd learned a lot from them. So I'd begun, I think, when I worked with Netflix, I'd begun to develop a lot of the restlessness that I spoke about earlier, about wanting to move away from just experiences in remote environments for the sake of experience, to wanting to tell stories with a purpose, and almost sort of feeling a bit uncomfortable about going on shoots where there wasn't a clear environmental or climate or scientific purpose to them. It wasn't a game anymore. I was seeing kind of global damage firsthand, and I wanted to play a part in doing something about it. And I'm in no way criticizing the BBC. I will be the first person to stand up and defend them. I think as a broadcaster, they are the envy of the world, and rightly so. And they've come a huge way with recent series like Blue Planet 2, Frozen Planet 2. But historically, some BBC productions, not all, but some, have shied away from tackling what have been but shouldn't be contentious issues, such as climate change and things like that. And I understand that there's a charter for the BBC. There's politics involved. It's been difficult in the past, and they've taken huge leaps and bounds in the right direction. But what was notable about my work with Netflix was that with the absence of a charter and the money behind a company like Netflix, they didn't have the same requirements or limitations in terms of being able to tackle these issues. So it was very exciting to be involved in Our Planet, which was the first big natural history production that was commissioned directly by Netflix, made by the same people who made The Hunt. But one of the big goals of that series was to tackle these issues head on and develop they called it the Halo Project, develop a kind of encompassing package of education and scientific discussion around the series. So it was just super exciting. I think Our Planet stands out to me as one of the first productions that really took a step forward into, okay, this isn't just about entertainment. This is a tool and a medium that we can try and change things through. And I think just the unique structure of Netflix and the sheer money behind them, it really enabled a new look at how we did that. So that was a super kind of exciting time as all these different streaming companies were moving into wildlife and expedition filmmaking. It was really exciting to be involved in the early days of that. And just the breadth of shoots I was doing at that stage. I still very much have my polar and mountain specialties, but for Netflix, I did shoots in Borneo where I went there on a number of occasions for the production. And every time I would go, we would witness firsthand the extent of deforestation. I worked a lot in an area called Mulu in the Sarawak province. And the short flight in from the local city, Miri, into Mulu, the village where we worked, every time I would make this 30, 45-minute flight, you'd fly over the jungles, and every time you would see the logging compounds getting closer and closer and closer to the national park, to the point where the last time I went there, there's almost no boundary anymore. And, going to Yellowstone, filming foxes and bobcats hunting out there, these shoots were cancelled halfway through because we were there in February and we needed frozen rivers and snow, and the snow was melting and the rivers weren't frozen, and we couldn't do what we needed to do. And then, other shoots that I did for Our Planet and Netflix down in Tanzania, looking at drought and the effects of upstream water irrigation and how that would impact on the environment. So it was just really, it's super exciting to be in that early stage where these productions started to have more direct purpose to them, and I got to be a part of that. Again, it's just a real privilege.
So looking at your work with the National Geographic, and indeed maybe just carrying through some of your experience from the BBC and Netflix, there seems to be like you said, it may be a more holistic progression through to Netflix, where there's sustainability, there's empirical evidence, and indeed maybe a real footprint or mindfulness of the carbon footprint. Could you maybe speak to how it differentiated again for National Geographic?
Yeah, National Geographic, it's a very different beast to the likes of Netflix and the Natural History Unit and some of the other production companies and broadcasters involved. I think fundamentally with National Geographic, it's a very different audience. Historically, it is very American, and it's very much geared at that American audience. It's going more global, and I'm talking specifically National Geographic, the TV channels here, not the magazine. It's important, I think, to make that distinction. But yeah, very American audience. And that showed through the different goals and aims of their production. Working with National Geographic, it was more of the kind of expedition shoots I did. And it was much more about human experience, about jeopardy on expedition, and about making complex science accessible. Pardon me. It was much more about human experience, much more about jeopardy on expedition, and making complex science accessible to viewers. National Geographic shoots that I've done have tended to have bigger teams, more intense goals, much shorter time frames. And I think that pulls in a lot of human factors, which, hopefully we can touch on a bit later in the conversation, because I think there's a real crossover between my filmmaking work in terms of human factors and medicine and human factors and how all this plays together. But I think that was much more apparent on National Geographic. The cave shoot that I mentioned was one such shoot that I did for them. Some of these natural history shoots for the BBC, it would be a team of 2 or 3 of us going into a remote area and being dropped off and fending for ourselves for a month. this National Geographic shoot in particular in Borneo, we were there for just over 3 weeks with a team of maybe, I think there was 20 of us, a number of presenters, 3 of us camera people, sound recordists. We had a paramedic with us. We had a number of guides, lots of local team helping us, fixers and porters and whatnot. So, yeah, I think naturally when you have more people and more moving parts, there's very different challenges. But it was also, it was no less exciting and no less purposeful because, some of the stuff that we were doing on that was making this complex science of environmental change accessible to people that wouldn't necessarily sit and watch an hour of animals being narrated by, a respectful English voice, frolicking around in the wilderness. They wanted something different, and some of the early work of National Geographic did a really good job, I think, of opening discussion around important issues to a completely different audience. But yeah, it's just, we've spoken about the BBC Natural History Unit, about Netflix, about National Geographic. They've all been fantastic broadcasters to work with, and a small number of the broadcasters I have worked with, there's many more, but they're all very distinct in what they do and how they approach it, both from an on the ground, I'm the camera person, I'm out on expedition perspective, and from a what the final product is perspective.
So there's a couple of aspects I'd like to look at, Ryan, around sort of self-care in these environments and maybe kit husbandry as well. Because I think one thing I've learned about being in extreme environments, albeit jungle or desert or mountainous environments, is, self-care is absolutely key, and everything sort of flows from that. But then you've got the added complexity of kit husbandry, of highly technical kit, electrical kit. Could you maybe speak to initially self-care and then maybe your approach to kit husbandry and how that had to sort of adapt and change across time? Yeah,
absolutely. So, we'll start with the self-care. So for all the talk of teamwork, look after yourself, and not meaning that in a selfish way, but like, if you can't function, you're no use to anyone else. So, simple things, look after your feet, in any expedition environment. If you can't look after your feet and you can't move, you're useless, and you're a sitting duck for any sort of risks and challenges that come along. So in a sense, you have to be a little bit selfish. You have to put yourself first from a care and health perspective. And then I think other things that are particularly important in working in those sort of difficult environments, and again, there's a lot of crossover to medicine here. It's really about identifying and communicating well your goals and ensuring efficiency in achieving them. I think, I like to think of an expedition environment as being something that requires battery power. And I'm not just talking about from a batteries for cameras perspective. I'm talking about, my body battery, if you will. Maybe I'm 100% before I go on expedition, and when I come back, I'm 0%. But I have to make that last for a month, because in an expedition environment, there's few, if any, opportunities to recharge. So I think it's crucial to work efficiently to be able to function well and achieve your goals. It's crucial to recognize that in that kind of environment, there are some things that can be controlled, such as your camp situation, the way you work and interact with your team members, the way you look after your equipment and yourself. And there's other things that can't be controlled, the weather. External factors, the local people you're working with, they have certain needs and wants and desires and motivations, and you can't change those. You have to slot in around them. It would be disrespectful to try and change them. So it's, identify your goals, make sure everyone knows your goals, identify the things that can be controlled and mitigate the things that can't be controlled. And all of that allows you to kind of free up the bandwidth that you need and the body battery, if you like, that you need to be able to achieve those goals, to whether that's, making a specific film, filming a certain wildlife behavior, for instance, or, undertaking a particular scientific experiment, it all kind of comes into this, risk identification, stratification, and that's what enables you to work well in those environments. Other things, never leave your accommodation without toilet paper. Carry a decent multi-purpose knife, and always look where you're putting your hands, because that's when things go wrong. And then, in terms of kit husbandry, if we're talking about the more kind of technical aspects of filmmaking and camera equipment, I think admin, just admin all day, every day, go out, film for 12, 13, 14 hours, come back, don't expect to sleep, get on with your admin and look after your equipment, because if you don't, it falls apart very quickly. These environments, whether that is, polar winter, or high altitude mountain, or a sopping wet rainforest, neither people nor technical equipment was designed to function well in these environments, and it's all about the admin. You have to have a plan A, a plan B, a plan C, and then throw it out the window and come up with a plan Z. You have to kind of, with all your equipment, it's about getting ahead of the problems before they occur. So in cold environments, cables break. There's something magical about the number of 36.5, minus 36.5 Celsius. I don't know what it is. Up to 36, well, down to 36.5. Things sort of work. Below 36.5, they just don't. I don't know what it is about 36.5, but things just break below that temperature. So have spares for all your vital components. As a photographer, to me, that means having spare cables, having spare LCD monitors for when the crystals inevitably freeze. It means having, in a rainforest, bags of silica gel and Ziploc bags for ensuring I can dry things out properly. From a medical perspective on expedition, it's going to mean, you're going to a polar environment. Do you have loads of cables for your life pack and your observations, or whatever equipment you're using from that perspective, because they're going to break, and you don't want a cardiac arrest where your defibrillator cables are all frozen and snapping. It's no good to anyone. So get ahead of the problems, kind of think about what challenges you're going to have, and then have a backup plan in place. And also have coffee, for me, is vital. Always have good coffee. I have a multitude of coffee making paraphernalia, and I never leave home without it. And the same can be said for now working on an ambulance as for when I was, working in the bush somewhere.
So I think we'll come on to that actually, and we'll start to look at the sort of medical chapter in your life. But absolutely, coffee is an essential. But also in the jungle, I was always cognizant of not putting my feet into boots. I would always kick out your boots, because you never know what's crawled into them in the night. And
I had this shoot, always springs to mind in Borneo. I'd done a few shoots out there. I kind of had my head screwed on about working in rainforest environments, but we had a young, I think he was a researcher, maybe an assistant producer with us. He'd never worked in the rainforest before. And so we set up our camp in the rainforest, and we explained the drill. So we're like, okay, well, you rig your hammock between two trees and get two sticks and put them in the ground underneath your hammock tarp. And at night, you get a little square of cardboard or carpet or something, stand on it, take your boots off, turn them upside down and put them on the sticks so nothing can crawl into them and no snakes can curl up in them overnight. And then turn your head torch to a red lamp so the insects don't get attracted. Strip off naked and make sure you've got no leeches on you. And only then, when you're safe, do you unzip your hammock, jump in it, zip it back up, and that's your safe space, that's your clean zone. But this AP or researcher thought we were just winding him up and wanted to make fun of him for getting naked in the jungle or something. So he didn't do any of this. And then the following morning, after the first night, we wake up and he walks over to the breakfast table and he sits down, and we get a look at his back, and his cream, brand new Crowcopper shirt is just stained red. The back of it is completely red with blood. And so, the guides obviously instantly know what's happened. They tell him to take his shirt off, and he's just got these, I think he had about 7 or 8 massive leeches just gorging on him. Yeah. So I forget how we got onto that, but it's a fun story.
Painful. Well, it actually is a nice segue, actually, Ryan, onto just sort of seminal cases whilst filming expeditions, because from a medical perspective, I think, you're starting to pre-COVID-19 pandemic, you were maybe thinking more about the medical aspect of things. I know your partner, I believe, is a nurse and was already in sort of a medical professional. Could you maybe speak to, before we look at the significant life pivot into paramedicine and training as an EMT, could you just speak to any sort of seminal medical moments you did have, indeed involving yourself or other people on expedition?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, so it was a bit. I was professionally, I was a cinematographer. That's what I did. Pardon me. Professionally, I was a cinematographer. That's what I did. That's why I was hired to go on expeditions. But alongside this, I'd also spent 8 years volunteering for mountain rescue. And in that role, I'd undertaken various kind of specialty trainings. One of which was casualty care in mountain rescue, which is it's not. It doesn't map over onto the kind of ambulance pre-hospital system, but it was the highest level of medical training within mountain rescue as an organization. It gave us the ability to give certain controlled drugs in certain situations, and undertake some more advanced clinical interventions pre-hospitally. So with that hat on, I often did go on these expeditions, also filling the role as sort of an advanced first aider, for lack of a better term, particularly the smaller expeditions where team numbers were limited and we couldn't maybe justify taking a dedicated medic or doctor with us. So, with that hat on, there's definitely a couple of things that spring to mind that I think I've learned lessons from, and hopefully can share them, and other people can learn the lessons without going through the same experiences. One of them is what happens when the medic becomes the casualty. So you mentioned it in the introduction there, but I think medevac is a strong word, but I was very swiftly pulled out of the field and sent to hospital in Tanzania after a scorpion sting. And this comes back to what we were saying, shake your boots out, look where you're putting your hands. I was packing up. It was the last day of the shoot. We'd spent 10 days filming African killer bees. So I'd been dangling on ropes in a baobab tree for 10 days, not stung once, absolutely fine. And then I'm in my tent, my safari tent, packing up on the last day, and just chilled out, got a bit of music on. We're flying home that evening, and I pick up one of my monitors to put it back in its case, and I felt this kind of stab on my hand. And initially I thought that I'd got one of those big, you get these really big thorns on some of the shrubs out in East Africa. And I thought maybe that I got one of those in my hand. And I put the monitor down, I looked down at my hand, and I sort of looked past my hand and saw this tiny little brown scorpion scuttle away underneath another case. And then I just freaked out, basically. And I think within 30 seconds to a minute, it was pain like I struggled to describe. It felt like someone was hammering a white hot nail through my palm and at the same time crushing my whole arm underneath a pile of bricks. And so I got out of my tent and I sprinted up to the kind of base area where the producer was sat with the local fixer. And I was like, guys, I've just been stung by a scorpion. I don't know what type. I don't know what's going to happen, but we probably need to get me to some medical care in case something bad happens. And on that expedition, I was the only one with any form of medical training, albeit not very advanced medical training at that stage. Certainly didn't really know anything about toxicology and venomation. But so then they piled me into the back of a Land Cruiser. There was a hospital a couple of hours down the road. So I'm on the flatbed at the back of the Land Rover with the producer, our fixers driving the Land Rover towards this hospital. And I just remember on the way, I was sort of passing out from the pain. It was just immense pain. Thankfully, nothing swelled up. I didn't go into anaphylaxis or anything, but the pain was, I was in and out of consciousness. And at the same time, I'm there trying to say to the producer, okay, there's a sterile kit of needles in my bag. This is the gauge that he should be using. This is where he should be thinking about injecting if he's going to give any anti-venom or any anesthetics. And then we get to the hospital, and it was well resourced, but it was an East African rural hospital. And I'm still kind of in and out of consciousness in immense pain. And I get on the table, and thankfully the producer's, taken everything on board I've said, and he pulls out my sterile kit and offers it to the doctors there to use, because you just don't know whether their needles are clean or not. So I ended up getting a lidocaine injection subcut in my hand, and that knocked me out again for a few minutes. And then I came to, and it didn't really seem to do much. But the key was that I was at some form of definitive care should things go south. But it was a real scary experience, not from what happened to me. I made a full recovery. I got upgraded on the flight home because I was there looking pale and whimpering with my arm in a sling. But I learned a lot about the need for every member of a team in that environment to have some level of training about not necessarily clinical intervention, but what to do when things go wrong, and to be prepared for it. Because, like I say, if the medic becomes the casualty, that's almost worst case scenario, because you're not going to have, unless it's a really big expedition, you're not going to have two medics. So it's really important, I think, as if you're there from a medical perspective, you have to look after yourself. It is absolutely vital, not just for yourself, but for the safety of the whole team, that you have to look after yourself, and you have to ensure everyone else knows the plans if things go wrong.
That's absolutely key, actually, Ryan. Yeah, just to say around, just it tests the whole CASEVAC plan in reality. And like you said, if people aren't briefed on that, it will test weaknesses in the plan. And that will, in reality, lead to the care being or patient care being delayed and or subverted. So it's absolutely key, like you said, that everyone knows the plan, it's well tested, and that actually there is this baseline of medical care amongst the team, even if it's just, as we teach on the courses, just teaching basic first aid to everyone at the start of an expedition, and also indeed where the basic kit is in their bag. So when they open the bag in anger, that's not the first time that they see the kit, that there's some kind of familiarity there.
Absolutely. I totally agree. I think another thing, as well as that kind of, like you say, that basic training going into something, maybe make sure everyone knows BLS, make sure everyone knows where the kit is, make sure everyone knows basic hemorrhage control. It's also about knowing the people on the team and knowing any pre-existing medical conditions or vulnerabilities that they may have. Another case that kind of always jumps to mind thinking about medical issues on expedition, I was doing a shoot in Peru, filming spectacled bears, and we were in a very remote area in the dry forests in northern Peru. It had taken 3 days, I think, of hiking to get into this location, up very steep mountainsides, and they don't do switchback paths in Peru. They just go straight up the front of the hill. So it was tough to get there, and the bush in the area was really difficult to work into. It was, there was no quick way out, none at all. If someone went down, it was either hope that we could find a helicopter with winch capability, or it was put the person on someone's back and walk them down the hill. And hope that you can do it in less than the 3 days that it takes you to get up the hill. But on that shoot, our local scientist had suffered from asthma, quite severe asthma, which, I think we knew she had asthma. We didn't know the severity to which she suffered from it, and we didn't know the triggers. And it turns out that a specific pollen in the bushes in the area where we were working were one of those triggers. Now, the scientist, she was a fantastic scientist, great individual doing amazing work. And she had a rescue kit there. She had a rescue kit with, I think, adrenaline, some EMOX and steroids. But for whatever reason, it didn't come up the mountain with us. And so after a few days of being at the top of the mountain filming, we were sat around camp one day and she started to have an asthma attack, which turned into probably borderline life-threatening asthma. She was starting to go unconscious. We were having to support her. Her breathing was incredibly rapid and shallow, but then starting to slow down in quite a worrying way. And this went on for maybe an hour and a half to 2 hours. It didn't start like it progressed. And I think all she had with her was a salbutamol inhaler. And we didn't know that this was something that could happen. We didn't have the appropriate equipment for it. Again, I was the only one with anything beyond, first aid at work level of training, but without a bag of equipment specific to her condition, there was very little I could do. We didn't have any oxygen. We certainly didn't have any bronchodilators or nebulizers. So it was just about supporting her as best as I could. But, what that showed me is I don't want to sound dramatic, but push the big red button early. So when it became clear that it was going south, I knew that I had an EpiPen in my first aid kit, which, I know has got adrenaline in it. Turns out it was slightly out of date. Again, poor preparation, but we got on a sat phone. We spoke to our medical providers and we said, look, if it comes to it, is it safe to give this? Will it help? And then we started the ball rolling on people looking at the availability of helicopters for medevac'd in the region. It didn't come to it. The scientist very thankfully recovered, was able to get her breathing under control, managed to clear the allergen from her system, and we were all okay. And we stayed up there for the rest of the shoot. But I was acutely aware that a medevac is a lot harder to get rolling in that sort of an environment than it is to cancel. So push the button early. If things are going south, get the ball rolling, contact whoever your bailout crew is, whoever your office team are, get on the sat phone to them, get on the sat phone early, because you can de-escalate quickly if you need to. But if you wait until things are really bad to start finding out where that helicopter is going to come from and how long it's going to take, then it's too late.
So Ryan, let's look at the significant shift in your life, because the COVID-19 pandemic certainly tested a lot of revenue streams and business plans and people's careers. And indeed, yourself, you took a dramatic pivot post sort of COVID-19 pandemic. Could you maybe sort of speak to what the synergist for that decision was, and also, as I'm joining into that question, what you carried through, because we've spoken there about sort of human factors and, plan A, plan B, plan C. I'd be really interested to see what you carried through from your time on expeditions and as a cinematographer. Could you maybe speak to both if possible?
Absolutely. It's a difficult question. I'd always, well, not always, but I think from a very early stage in my career, I knew that for me, at least, it was time limited. I did not want to be the 50, 60-year-old with a bad back, struggling to get around in the wilderness, being a weak link in the team, and not enjoying it. I wanted to have a family, and I didn't want to not see my children grow up. At this stage, I was spending 6 to 8 months of the year abroad, and I think with the pandemic, lots of things just came together. So I had this awareness that the only other thing that had ever interested me was paramedicine and pre-hospital care. And I had in my mind that was where I was going to go when I felt I'd done my time on expedition filmmaking. And then the pandemic came along, and I remember this one weekend in, I think it was late February 2020, when the pandemic was not even really here in the UK. It was this thing on our shores. We knew it was coming. We could see it in Italy. We'd heard about it in China, but it wasn't here. But airports started closing around the world and border controls started coming in. And in one weekend, I lost a year and a half worth of work. You know, we were on a little holiday with some friends in Wales. And from the Saturday morning, I literally went from a year and a half worth of bookings to nothing, zero. All of my work had gone. And so I think one issue was that highlighted to me the vulnerabilities of a career as a self-employed cinematographer who relied on being able to travel. At the same time, I had been developing a bit of a restlessness and unease around my career from, I think, a number of perspectives. I was acutely aware of the impact on the environment of what I was doing. And I'm not talking, I'm not one for flight shaming. I think it's important that we go around and we communicate these issues. And if the ability to do that means taking a long haul flight somewhere, I'm not going to point the finger at someone who's doing that. But with the boom of streaming services making these productions, there were, 5, 6, 7 film crews going to the same place to film the same story at the same time. And that's not sustainable to me. And then also I had this unease. I was aware that it had got to the stage in that career, it wasn't good for my mental health anymore. It is viciously competitive, which is good in a sense that it engenders talent and development and excellence, but it's also brutal. It's all self-employed by nature. So you are out there pitching yourself all the time, selling yourself, saying, hey, I'm better than this person, hire me. And it just wasn't good for me. And the comparison of why is person X working and I'm not, why did they get this job and I didn't? And I could feel the effects on my mental health of that. So there was that kind of restlessness and unease. There was the loss of my work. And I started volunteering for London Ambulance Service. Initially, I got in touch with them, thinking, well, hey, here am I miserable and unemployed. And here's the ambulance service busy and on their knees. And I got in touch with them thinking I would just help with make ready or packing bags or whatever it was I could do to help. And they actually invited me to go out on ambulances as part of the London Ambulance Service's COVID support scheme. So working on a double crewed ambulance alongside a paramedic, delivering clinical care because of my background in mountain rescue. So I started doing that. And then I had a daughter at the end of 2020. And I think that was the final catalyst, because that was a big value for me, is I wanted to see my kid grow. So I did a couple final shoots in 2021, big shoots. I had a couple of months abroad when she was very young, but it was tough. And then things just fell into place. Cumbria University announced this new paramedic degree apprenticeship that they're doing. And at the same time, the London Ambulance Service started recruiting trainee. At the time, it was trainee emergency ambulance crew. Now it's trainee emergency medical technician. And I thought, well, look, here's my way in. If I don't do it now, then when? I'm not able to fund myself going back to university to study paramedic sciences. So here's a great opportunity to learn on the job and to start making inroads into a really exciting new career. And I certainly haven't turned my back on filmmaking. I still freelance. I still go on shoots here and there. This summer, I did a shoot out in the Italian Alps, sort of like science, living history shoot. But yeah, there was this moment where all of these different kind of niggles that I had just seemed to be answered by this moment of perfect timing. And I jumped the gun and I went, okay, let's go for it. And so I started training full time with London Ambulance Service in August last year. And I have just handed in all of my practice placement portfolio and had everything signed off and all my essays. So I am now just waiting for a date for my final exams, and then I will be a qualified EMT. But it's been a really exciting journey. Yeah, it's been great. And like you say, there's lots of crossover around human issues. I can't see myself ever working in a 9-to-5 office job. And I'm not knocking people that do. That's for some people. It's not for me. I thrive on the unpredictability. I thrive on kind of the meticulous approach to it, and the necessity for good admin and preparation and continuous learning, striving to be at the top of your game all the time. A lot of the same challenges are there, but it's a really exciting journey, kind of learning about all this new stuff and looking at how people skills and ways of working that I've developed through expedition can better my practice as a pre-hospital clinician.
So Ryan, looking at that and just the fruition of bringing through all the experience from the filming, what kind of challenges and cases does London manifest from a pre-hospital perspective compared to maybe indeed the challenges from your prior career?
Yeah, I think, it's not London specific, but one thing that jumps to mind is as a real challenge is reconciling that experience as a creative professional with this new world of algorithms and guidelines and JR Calc and NICE and the British Thoracic Society and all of this very specific way of doing things, where I have spent 12 years sort of figuring things out as I go and looking outside of the box and thinking about new ways of doing things. There's a lot of value to that in pre-hospital care from a research perspective, but there's also a real importance of knowing guidelines, knowing algorithms, doing the right things in the right order at the right time. So it's been a real interesting challenge to kind of reconcile those two things together. London specifically, I think, London Ambulance Service has a lot of the same challenges as the rest of the UK, but it also has some unique ones. I work in Southeast London, so our hospital flow here is pretty good. It's a rarity for me to be queuing at hospital for more than 20 minutes or so. I say that having queued for 3 hours last night, but that's unusual. I'm seeing in a 12-hour shift, I'm seeing 7 or 8 patients. So I personally don't experience those same challenges that I know clinicians elsewhere in the country are having to tackle and deal with at the moment. But, I think unique to London, our case turnover is insane. I worked a Sunday recently, and a Sunday you expect to be one of the quieter days of more low acuity calls. But I think we hit over 6,500 CADs on a Sunday. And I'm doing, like I say, 7 or 8 patients a shift, all very different patients. There's a real diversity of calls in London, which I think, I don't have experience of other services, but all I can say is from what I get here, all of the challenges that diversity of calls, that the social deprivation in inner city London, things like that throw up. It's a real good training ground. And I hope that diversity of pre-hospital experience will make me a better clinician if and when I choose to move to a different ambulance service or a different region and practice there. One other thing I want to note on, I think, I mentioned the social deprivation. I think something that, as someone who's new to the game, as it were, something that really shocked me was the social deprivation in inner city London. And, I knew social deprivation was there. I'm not blind to it, but seeing the impact that has on healthcare and people's health, that's not something I'd experienced. That's not something I'd seen before going into this. And one thing that's kind of notable here in London is our accessibility to healthcare is very high. There are a lot of hospitals. There are a lot of GP practices. There are a lot of urgent care centres. But self-care is very low in a lot of the population. So, that's, again, another real challenge, and another really interesting observation is that you can throw all the resources you want at something, and all the pathways and all the joint working with advanced paramedics and HEMS teams that we have down here, and urgent response teams and all of that. But there needs to be some different solution, because we have the access to all of the best pathways you can want here in London, but we still have big problems around people taking responsibility for their care and accessing those services by choice. That's been a real eye-opener, I think, to learn about that.
And interestingly, as an adjoiner to that, really, Ryan, is self-care amongst the population of paramedics, and that's wider than London, and I think it reaches nationally and internationally. But again, this is maybe not for this podcast, and maybe not for now, but just the approach to self-care. And as we were speaking before on expedition, and how you've carried that through, because actually you have to steward good self-care if you're doing your run of 4 or 5 or 6 night shifts, and there has to be a semblance of good nutrition, good sleep, good exercise. But do you feel like that you've hopefully carried that through from your expedition experience?
Absolutely. I think my expedition experience has given me a resilience that I wouldn't have had it not been for some of the things that I've been through, some of the things that I've witnessed, some of the people that I've worked with. I have met incredible people from cultures all over the world, and had so many conversations over a glass of vanilla rum in the jungle, or whatever it is that I've learned. And I've learned something from every one of those people that's made me a more, I think, mentally resilient person. And then, as you say, physically as well, I am probably a couple of stone heavier than I was a few years back. And I'm a dad now, so I feel like that's okay. But I learned the importance of regular exercise. And physically, if you're going to work in a field, whether that's expedition filmmaking, expedition medicine, or working on a DCA in inner city London, you can't help other people unless you look after yourself. And this job will take its toll on you mentally and physically. And it's vital to have an outlet for the stress that works for you, whether that's digging into a book or talking to friends, or for me, it's going running regularly. You've got to have somewhere to get away from it and look after yourself and get your head screwed back on, so that you can help the people that look to us on their worst days.
So Ryan, just coming into land on the conversation, actually, what does the future hold for you? Sort of where do you want to take the training, and indeed, where are your aspirations within pre-hospital care?
Yeah, at the moment, obviously, I'm hopefully pretty close to qualifying as an EMT. I just have this final hurdle of my exams, which should be within the next month or two, and then I plan to move, hopefully fairly swiftly, onto the paramedic degree apprenticeship. It's not about wanting to rush technician stuff. It's just, I think I've always known that paramedicine is where I want to go. And there's great opportunity in the workforce at the moment to develop into that. There's a lot of places on these new degree apprenticeships. So I kind of want to take that opportunity whilst it's there. So yeah, it's qualify as an EMT, then it's get on to being a paramedic, and then become a good paramedic. I have a particular interest in critical care, in trauma, in human factors in medicine. At this stage, I have aspirations of moving into advanced practice in critical care. I'm fully aware that might change. It's not about the big, exciting jobs. To me, I'm more interested in those kind of advanced interventions and how interesting it is bringing the hospital to the roadside. But, I'm new to the job. And in 5 years' time, I might be more interested in the urgent care or the GP route. I think that's the exciting thing about paramedicine and pre-hospital care, is there's a lot of different opportunities for people in the field at the moment. So, yeah, I have aspirations to move into advanced practice, but I have a very open mind about what opportunities might present themselves in the future. And I'll always be a photographer and an expedition addict, and I'll always want to get out into the wilds of the world and rough it up and have fun with cool people in cool places. So I think finding some way to mesh that side of me with the pre-hospital clinician side of me, particularly as my daughter grows a bit older, I think is something that is a definite place I want to go.
Ryan, listen, thank you so much for the last hour. I really do appreciate your time and perspectives, and it's just been fantastic tracking through some of your experiences, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been great talking.
Thanks for listening to the episode. Please feel free to rate, review, and subscribe on whichever platform you're listening to. Please also head over to the World Extreme Medicine website, where you can find more engaging content on extreme medicine webinars and indeed the collection of courses from our global network, including humanitarian, disaster relief, expedition, space, military, tactical, and performance medicine. Thanks again.